May 27, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning light cut through the thin blinds of the intelligence office, like slivers of truth trying to break through the fog of war. Commander Edwin T. Layton, U.S. Navy intelligence officer for the Pacific Fleet, stood over a large map pinned to the wall. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent chasing ghosts in radio chatter and cryptic transmissions. Outside, the harbor still bore the scars of December 7th. The twisted remains of the USS Arizona lay beneath the waters like a tombstone, a silent reminder of what happens when intelligence comes too late. Inside, a different kind of battle was being fought, not with bullets, but with numbers, syllables, and logic. Across the room, the steady hum of decoding machines from Station HYPO filled the air, metallic and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of an invisible army. Sheets of intercepted Japanese communications poured in, strings of 5-digit ciphers that meant nothing at first glance. But to Layton and his colleagues, men like Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts, every number was a clue, every message a puzzle piece in Japan's grand plan. Rochefort, wearing his trademark bathrobe and chewing on a pipe, leaned over a desk littered with coffee cups and cipher sheets. "We're close," he muttered, half to himself. JN-25's giving way. JN-25, the Japanese Navy's operational code. A labyrinth of over 30,000 possible code groups, updated regularly to keep American eyes blind. But the men of HYPO had been relentless, breaking fragments of it since before Pearl Harbor. Now, something big was coming. Layton's pencil traced a pattern on the Pacific chart, faint circles expanding outward from Japan's home islands toward the heart of the Central Pacific. "They're moving east," he said softly, "and they're bringing the carriers." But where? That was the question Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, demanded an answer to. The Japanese called it Operation MI. American analysts didn't know what AF, the target, meant. Some guessed it could be Port Moresby. Others thought perhaps the Aleutians. But Rochefort had a hunch. "AF is Midway," he insisted. Layton trusted him. Others didn't. Washington doubted it, said it was speculation, not intelligence. But Layton and Rochefort needed proof. So they devised a ruse. They sent a message from Midway deliberately unencrypted, reporting a freshwater shortage. Within hours, a Japanese transmission was intercepted. AF reports running low on water. That was it. The trap was set. AF wasn't an abstract code anymore. It was Midway, a tiny coral atoll halfway between Hawaii and Japan. And the Japanese were coming for it. On May 27th, Layton walked into Nimitz's office, the tropical air thick with a smell of salt and oil. He placed his report on the Admiral's desk, a forecast not of weather, but of war. "Sir," Layton began, his voice steady, "we believe the enemy carriers will launch their attack on Midway the morning of June 4th, approaching from the northwest, bearing 325 degrees. They'll be sighted at roughly 175 miles from the atoll, around 0700 hours. Nimitz listened without blinking, eyes narrowing at the precision. Around him, the Pacific's fate hung on that prediction, an invisible thread connecting numbers to strategy and strategy to survival. The Admiral finally nodded. "Very well, Commander," he said. "We'll be ready for them." As Layton left the room, the map of the Pacific seemed alive. Red pins marking enemy movements, blue pins the American defense. But behind those colors were lives, hundreds of pilots, sailors, and cryptographers whose fates now hinged on one man's confidence in his codebreakers. Outside, the tropical rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the office windows like the ticking of a clock counting down to June 4th. Layton paused, staring toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sailing into a trap they didn't yet know existed. And in a few days' time, the accuracy of his prediction would astonish the world. June 1st, 1942. Midway Atoll, Central Pacific. The surf broke gently against the coral reef, hissing like a whisper of warning. On the narrow strips of land that made up Midway, A small garrison of Marines, aviators, and construction workers turned the atoll into a fortress of sandbags, barbed wire, and anti-aircraft guns. It was the last line of defense before Hawaii, before the United States itself. In the command bunker, Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. Shannon reviewed defensive maps, his uniform damp with sweat. The heat inside the concrete shelter was suffocating, but no one complained. Every man there understood the stakes. They'd been told to expect a Japanese assault, possibly an invasion. They didn't know how accurate the prediction was, or that it came from a handful of men poring over intercepted code at Pearl Harbor. But they trusted Admiral Nimitz, and Nimitz trusted Layton. Back in Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet headquarters was a hive of silent urgency. Pinned to a giant plotting board in the intelligence room was a new arrangement of colored pins, blue for American carriers, red for Japanese. 3 U.S. carriers were already moving into position: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. They were ghosts on the sea, moving under radio silence, their locations known only to Nimitz and his closest advisors. Nimitz stood before the plotting board, hands clasped behind his back. "We'll ambush them here," he said, tapping the map just northeast of Midway. "They'll think we're on the defensive. Instead, we'll strike from above." Commander Layton was beside him, flipping through a folder of decrypted messages. "HYPO confirms increased activity on the JN-25 channel," he said. "Fleet elements from Kure, Sasebo, and Hashirajima are all converging toward the Central Pacific. The attack force is likely under Admiral Nagumo, same man who led the Pearl Harbor strike." Nimitz exhaled slowly. "Good. Let him come." The plan depended on one fragile thread: the precision of intelligence. If Layton was wrong by even a day, or by 100 miles, the Japanese could strike first. And if that happened, the Pacific Fleet, still rebuilding after Pearl Harbor, might not recover. Meanwhile, far out in the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was executing his masterpiece. His goal: lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive trap. He believed the U.S. fleet was demoralized, its intelligence blinded. To him, Midway was bait, a target so tempting that the Americans would rush in to defend it. Once they did, his combined forces, over 200 ships, including 4 frontline carriers, would crush them. But Yamamoto didn't know that his communications were being read like an open book. At Station HYPO, the cryptanalysts worked around the clock. The room smelled of stale coffee and ink. Typewriters clattered, fans buzzed, and men argued over cipher sheets scrawled with Japanese kana and pencil notes. Rochefort leaned back in his chair, stretching. "They're moving out," he said to his assistant, Chief Radioman Thomas Dyer. "Convoy size indicates the strike force has left Japan. The first contact reports should come in within 48 hours. Dyer nodded. "Then Layton's prediction holds." Rochefort grinned faintly. "If it doesn't, I'll be reassigned to weather duty." Outside, the Hawaiian night sky was clear, the stars like pinpricks of code across the heavens, distant, silent, precise. The next morning, Layton received the final decrypted confirmation. The Japanese strike force, designated Kido, Butai, had departed from Hashirajima under Nagumo's command. The timing matched his projections almost perfectly. He went straight to Nimitz's office, report in hand. The admiral read it silently, then looked up with the calm certainty of a man who already knew how history would remember this day. "Very well," Nimitz said, turning to his aide. "Send word to Fletcher and Spruance. Tell them to hold position northeast of Midway. The moment Nagumo launches, we strike back." The room fell silent. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock, each second a step closer to June 4th. Layton adjusted his glasses and glanced at the Pacific chart. His pencil had marked a single precise point, 175 miles northwest of Midway, bearing 325 degrees. He didn't know it yet, but that dot on the map would soon mark the exact spot where destiny would meet the Japanese fleet, almost to the minute and almost to the mile. June 3rd, 1942. 0500 hours. Midway Atoll. The first light of dawn washed across the Pacific, painting the sea in bands of gold and indigo. A Marine sentry on Sand Island lifted his binoculars, squinting toward the horizon. The ocean was calm, deceptively so, the kind of quiet that came before storms and invasions. In the command bunker, Colonel Shannon stood over the plotting table as radar operators tracked faint echoes, planes hundreds of miles out. They couldn't tell what they were yet, but everyone knew what it meant. The Japanese were coming. Above the atoll, Army Air Forces B-17 flying fortresses droned into the sky, engines roaring, their bellies loaded with bombs. The pilots grinned, slapped each other on the back, and climbed into formation. "Let's go meet the Emperor's boys," one said. On the distant sea, beyond the curve of the world, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo's strike force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed through the swells. Their decks were alive with motion. Deck crews in white hachimaki headbands wheeled out Zero fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. The Imperial Navy's air arm, the same that had devastated Pearl Harbor, was ready to repeat its triumph. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, binoculars in hand, the morning sun gleaming off the polished brass fittings around him. To his right, Air Officer Minoru Genda reviewed strike plans. Their intelligence said the American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor. The operation, so far, was proceeding perfectly. But 500 miles away, hidden among the cloud banks and ocean swells, 3 U.S. carriers were waiting, exactly where Nimitz had placed them. On board USS Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance walked the flight deck, the sea wind tugging at his khaki jacket. His pilots lounged beside their planes, smoking and checking gear, trying to look calm. The Enterprise's decks reeked of aviation fuel and salt air. Every few minutes, the loudspeakers crackled with updates from reconnaissance planes sweeping the horizon. "Still nothing, sir," came the report from the observation deck. Spruance nodded, but his jaw was tight. He turned to his operations officer. "They'll come from the northwest. Layton's numbers say 325 degrees, 175 miles. Mark that." The officer glanced up. "That precise?" Spruance smiled faintly. "That precise." On USS Yorktown, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher studied his own chart room, finger tracing over the atoll. His ship still bore the scars of Coral Sea, bulkheads patched, flight deck scorched. But she was battle-ready. Fletcher was in overall command, but the real advantage lay in the information he held. The Japanese thought Yorktown was sunk. Back at Pearl, Layton sat by the radio console, headset pressed to his ear, listening for fragments of contact reports. Each static burst carried the weight of weeks of work, of decryptions, sleepless nights, and risk. His eyes flicked to the clock. 2,300 hours. One more night until the prediction would be tested. Rochefort, still in his bathrobe, entered the room holding a cup of coffee. "You ever think," he said with a tired grin, "what if we're wrong?" Layton looked up, expression flat. "Then the Japanese win the Pacific." Rochefort nodded, letting out a low whistle. No pressure then. At sea, the American task force moved in radio silence. The moonlight rippled over carrier decks as aircraft handlers slept beside their planes, heads resting on parachutes. Beneath the surface, submarines slithered through the dark, Nautilus, Tambor, Trout, all on high alert. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, an empty stage waiting for its actors to clash. As midnight passed, Spruance wrote a brief note in his log. June 4th approaches. Intelligence predicts enemy contact between 0650 and 0710. Bearing 325 degrees for Midway. God grant Layton is right. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind to launch their first wave. The storm that would decide the Pacific had begun to move. June 4th, 1942. 0430 hours. Aboard IGN Akagi, northwest of Midway. The first light of dawn crept across the waves as the flight deck came alive. Ground crews scrambled like ants, loading bombs, checking fuel lines, pulling chocks from Zero fighters lined wingtip to wingtip. Beneath the rising sun, the crimson circles on each aircraft glowed like blood on steel. Admiral Nimitz stood on the bridge, cap pulled low, binoculars fixed on the horizon. His orders were clear: launch the first wave to neutralize Midway's defenses. Then, when the American fleet inevitably responded, finish them with the reserve force. Launch the first attack, Nimitz commanded. A whistle blew. The deck officer waved his flag, and one by one, planes leapt into the air, 108 aircraft in all, roaring eastward toward Midway. Within minutes, the strike formation was a dark ribbon across the sky. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and their Mitsubishi A-6M0 escorts. The sunlight flashed off their canopies like a signal to the gods of war. Below, on the tranquil atoll of Midway, radar screens flickered to life. Large inbound formation, bearing 325, distance 175 miles. The radar operator's voice was urgent, breaking through static. Colonel Shannon's head snapped up. 325? Confirm that. Confirmed. Bearing 325 degrees, range 175 miles. The words hit like thunder. The exact numbers Layton had predicted. The exact direction, distance, and time. At 0700 hours, just as the first sunbeams touched the lagoon, the sky over Midway erupted. Japanese bombers dove out of the clouds, sirens wailing, bombs screaming through the air. Explosions tore across the runways, sending sand and steel skyward. The defenders fired back with everything they had: .50 caliber machine guns, 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and .30 caliber Brownings mounted on trucks. Flames licked across the oil tanks and hangars. The air was thick with smoke and burning fuel. Yet, amid the chaos, the Marine and Army pilots launched their Wildcats, Buffaloes, and Vindicators, clawing into the sky to meet the enemy head-on. Vipers 1 through 5, engage at will, came the command over the radio. In minutes, the battle became a chaotic swirl of tracer fire and vapor trails. The Japanese pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, cut through the defenders with ruthless precision. Planes spun into the sea, black smoke marking their graves. But the defenders had done their job. Their desperate resistance and frantic radio calls confirmed exactly what Nimitz needed to know. The Japanese carriers were there, northwest of Midway, precisely where Layton said they'd be. Aboard USS Enterprise, Admiral Spruance received the message. He looked at his clock. 0655 hours. Sir, his operations officer said, Midway reports heavy enemy attack. Bearing 325. Spruance smiled tightly. 5 minutes early, he murmured. Layton was off by 5 minutes. He turned sharply. Launch Strike Group 1. All aircraft. Target enemy carriers northwest. The order rippled through the ship. Sirens blared. Deck crews rushed to ready the planes, Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, Wildcat fighters. Engines roared to life. The smell of aviation fuel and salt mixed into an electric haze. Pilots strapped in, faces set, eyes focused on the deck ahead. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's bombers, stood in the cockpit of his SBD Dauntless, goggles reflecting the dawn. Let's get some payback, he muttered. On USS Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher followed suit. Launch all planes. Target sighted northwest of Midway. Dozens of planes screamed into the air, rising in tight formations. From above, they looked like a swarm of hornets racing toward vengeance. Below deck, in the intelligence room aboard Enterprise, a young officer marked a red X on the plotting chart. 175 miles northwest of Midway, bearing 325 degrees. The exact point of enemy contact. Back in Pearl Harbor, Layton watched the clock tick past 0700. Reports were already coming in. Midway under attack. Enemy carriers sighted northwest. He looked to Nimitz, who stood calmly by the map table, hands clasped behind his back. The Admiral's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Commander, he said, without looking up, you're only 5 minutes 5 degrees and 5 miles out. Layton exhaled, a slow, quiet breath that carried weeks of tension. Outside, the rain had stopped. The Pacific sun broke through, as if the war's tide itself was about to shift. June 4, 1942. 0930 hours. 175 miles northwest of Midway. The Pacific stretched like a mirror beneath the morning sun, calm, gleaming, deceptive. But that calm was about to be shattered. High above the ocean, the American strike groups were converging, squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown all following different vectors, searching desperately for the Japanese carriers. The radios crackled with static and clipped reports, the voices tense, oxygen masks muffling the words. Fuel getting low, one pilot reported. No contact yet. The Japanese fleet, meanwhile, was in chaos of its own making. After the first attack on Midway, Nagumo's pilots returned reporting partial success, airfields damaged but not destroyed. And then came the news that shook the Akagi's bridge. Enemy aircraft carriers sighted to the northeast. Nagumo froze. His reserve planes were armed with land bombs, not anti-ship torpedoes. He had to make a choice, rearm for a second strike on Midway or prepare to face the American fleet. He hesitated. Below deck, crews worked feverishly, rolling bombs back into storage and hauling torpedoes from the armory. The wooden decks became cluttered with live ordnance. Fuel lines stretched across the surface, bomb carts rolling between Zero fighters waiting for new orders. At that exact moment, the first American planes found them. It was Torpedo Squadron 8 VT-8 from USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. 15 slow, outdated Douglas TBD Devastators flying at wave-top height, and they'd come in without fighter cover. Target in sight, Waldron radioed. We'll attack from the east. He knew the odds. Every man in that squadron did. The Devastator was sluggish and poorly armored. Suicide against fast, maneuverable Zeros. But they pressed on. At 0920, the first Japanese lookouts spotted them. Zeros screamed down from 10,000 feet, guns blazing. The sky filled with tracers and smoke. Devastators burned and fell, one after another, spiraling into the sea. Not one of Waldron's planes scored a hit. Not one survived. But their sacrifice was not in vain. While the Zeros were dragged low, chasing the doomed torpedo planes, another formation appeared high above the clouds. Enterprise's SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. McCluskey had been searching for hours, nearly out of fuel. At 1,020 hours, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, Arisher, racing north at full speed. It had been depth charging a U.S. submarine, and now was hurrying to rejoin the fleet. McCluskey made the call. Follow that ship. It'll lead us straight to them. Moments later, the clouds parted. And there they were. 4 Japanese carriers, decks packed with fueled planes, bombs scattered like seeds of fire. McCluskey's voice cut through the radio. All planes attack. Dive. 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 The Dauntless peeled over into near vertical dives, air screaming past their canopies. The ocean spun beneath them. Tracer fire streaked upward. But it was too late. The Japanese carriers were caught defenseless, their decks ticking time bombs. At 1,022 hours, the first 1,000-pound bomb hit Kaga. Then another. Then another. Explosions ripped through her decks, fireballs consuming everything in an instant. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo barely had time to grasp what was happening before a Dauntless from Enterprise released its payload. A single bomb that struck near the mid-deck elevator, penetrating into the hangar below. Flames erupted through the ship. The flagship of the Japanese strike force was mortally wounded. Akagi was burning. Kaga was burning. Soryu, hit moments later by Yorktown's bombers, was engulfed in smoke. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were aflame within 6 minutes. On Enterprise, pilots who'd been silent through the dive now shouted through their headsets, a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. Direct hits. Kaga's done. Akagi burning. We got them. McCluskey pulled up from his dive, the sea rushing past below. Behind him, plumes of black smoke reached thousands of feet into the sky. Down in Pearl Harbor, Layton received the coded report. He and Rochefort stood in stunned silence as the message came through. Enemy carriers burning. Estimated 3 out of 4 destroyed. Layton removed his glasses, staring blankly for a moment, as if the words were too good to believe. Rochefort grinned, the first real grin in months. Looks like our math worked, Commander. Layton nodded slowly. No, he said. Looks like their arrogance didn't. Back at sea, Nagumo's surviving carrier, Hiryu, launched one desperate counterattack. Her bombers found Yorktown and hit her hard. The ship shuddered, smoke pouring from her decks. But even that victory was fleeting. American scouts soon found Hiryu herself, and by 1700 hours, she too was burning. By nightfall, all four of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. The heart of the Imperial Navy lay scattered across the waves. And it had all unfolded almost exactly as predicted, within 5 minutes, 5 miles, and 5 degrees. June 5, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The tropical sun rose over the harbor's calm waters, the same waters that had once burned with oil and death just 6 months earlier. But this morning, the air was different, lighter somehow, charged with the unspoken realization that something immense had shifted. Inside the underground command center, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood at the head of the operations table. His aides shuffled through decoded dispatches, radiograms, and contact reports, the air thick with cigarette smoke and exhaustion. Commander Edwin T. Layton entered quietly, the same worn folder in his hand, the one he'd placed before Nimitz just days earlier. Only now, its contents were history, not prediction. He stopped by the table and saluted. Sir, final reports confirm 4 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed. Minimal losses to our own. Midway is secure. Nimitz didn't look up immediately. He was studying the Pacific map, now dotted with small paper markers. Red for Japanese losses, blue for U.S. positions. The 4 red markers sat clustered just northwest of Midway, almost perfectly aligned with the point Layton had drawn in pencil on May 27th. The Admiral finally turned, his expression unreadable. And the enemy fleet? Retreating westward in disarray, Layton replied. Our patrols are picking up debris and survivors. Yamamoto's main force is withdrawing. For a long moment, the room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the radio equipment. Then Nimitz allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Commander, he said softly, you were only 5 minutes 5 degrees and 5 miles out. Layton exhaled, the tension that had clung to him for weeks melting away. Around the table, officers exchanged glances, admiration, disbelief, quiet pride. The Pacific Fleet had fought the most decisive battle of the war using nothing but intelligence, trust, and nerve. Outside, the base was coming alive. Mechanics worked over returning aircraft, their wings still scorched from battle. Sailors on the docks read the latest dispatches aloud, cheers echoing across the piers. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, hope felt real, tangible. At Station HYPO, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood amid a jungle of decoding machines and tangled wires, the remnants of countless intercepted messages. He held a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago, staring at a printout of the last JN-25 intercepts. His team, half asleep on desks and chairs, had finally stopped working. Victory had silenced the machines for the first time in weeks. Rochefort chuckled softly. Well, he muttered, I guess Midway wasn't about weather reports after all. He turned to the wall, where a simple hand-drawn map still hung, an early sketch of the Pacific with red arrows converging on Midway, labeled AF in pencil. Beneath it, someone had scribbled in block letters. AF equals Midway, confirmed. It wasn't a grand office. It wasn't glamorous. But from this cramped, airless room, the course of the Pacific War had been rewritten. Meanwhile, out on the open sea, the wreckage of Japan's once invincible Kido, Butai, still smoldered beneath the waves. Oil slicks stretched for miles. Lifeboats drifted aimlessly, the cries of survivors fading into the wind. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard his distant flagship Yamato, received the grim reports in silence. His strategy, the plan meant to destroy the American fleet and force peace on Japan's terms, had failed catastrophically. He closed his eyes for a long moment. The moment one underestimates the enemy, he said quietly to his staff, victory begins to slip away. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz stood on the balcony overlooking the bay. He could see the salvaged ships from December's attack, some still under repair, others ready to return to sea. Beyond them, the sun glittered on the Pacific, the same sea that had just witnessed the turning of the tide. Layton joined him, standing silently at his side. "You trusted them," Nimitz said finally. "Rochefort. HYPO. The math. The instinct." "Yes, sir," Layton replied. "They gave us the truth. We just had to believe it." Nimitz nodded. "And now, the Japanese will never advance east again. From now on, we carry the fight." The two men stood there a moment longer, watching the morning light break across the water. For the first time, Pearl Harbor no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a beginning. History would call it the Battle of Midway, a victory so improbable it bordered on miraculous. But for the men who lived it, it wasn't luck. It was intellect, dedication, a war fought in silence before the first bomb ever fell. And in the stillness of that Hawaiian morning, the Pacific War turned. Forever.